Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Science at Melbourne public lecture. My name is Professor Moira O'Brien, and I have the pleasure of being the Dean of Science here at the University of Melbourne. First, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we meet this evening, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. I also acknowledge the traditional owners and First Nations peoples of the land from which our online audiences are joining us tonight. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are Australia's first scientists with deep and enduring knowledge of the lands, waters and skies. And I particularly pay my respects to any First Nations people joining us here this evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of the Science at Melbourne lecture series for 2025. I want to first say thank you to the staff at Bio21 for hosting us this evening here in the David Pennington building. I have a lab here on level 4 of this building. It is a lovely place to work, but it's also, I'm very happy to share it with some of the audiences who are here. There is some outstanding research that happens in this building, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit about it. But these lectures are some of my favourite events on our calendar, as it gives us the opportunity to share our faculty's knowledge and love of science with the wider community. And public lectures have been a long-standing tradition in higher education institutions all around the world, and they are so for a very good reason. Events like this allow us to share the work of our amazing researchers and explore some of the most pressing problems of our time. In a climate that is increasingly uncertain and with science under scrutiny, having discussions like this has never been more important. Tonight's discussion, Australia and the Pacific Islands, Solidarity in the Time of Climate Crisis, is both extremely important and extremely timely, as well as a great example of the breadth of our researchers within the Faculty of Science. And we love talking about what we do and meeting with engaged and curious people like yourselves to share these conversations. As you will hear tonight from our panellists, engaging with our communities and sharing learnings is central to everything we do, and it is essential for change. The climate crisis continues to evolve, with coastal erosion occurring at increasing rates, sea levels rising and global temperatures increasing, and the need for change has never been more urgent. Low-lying nations, particularly those in the Pacific Islands, are on the front line of this crisis, already weathering the impacts of droughts, coastal erosion and food insecurity. Whilst it might be easy or convenient to imagine that this is a problem solely for the Pacific, as close neighbours and indeed we are, and close neighbours and ourselves being an island nation, there is a great deal that we can learn and share, and a lot that we should and could do together. Our panellists tonight each have personal and professional experience collaborating with communities in a wide range of Pacific nations, including in preparing communities to adapt to climate change. Whether deciding to migrate or to embrace nature-based solutions to affect policy change or to strengthen food security, our panellists have a depth of knowledge that will have an impact both in the Pacific Islands and here at home. Our moderator will introduce each of our panellists in greater detail shortly, so instead I will focus on him. Our moderator tonight is a champion for the University of Melbourne internationally and at home, and a leader in foreign policy and engagement. As Deputy Vice-Chancellor Global Culture and Engagement at the University of Melbourne, Michael takes a leading role in the university's service to and engagement with stakeholders, partners, governments and communities, both locally and globally. And global engagement is central to ensuring our students and academics are primed to make a positive impact as we partner with communities. And Michael has a key role in shaping our student experience and to make them into capable global citizens and to contribute to the stability and wellness of Australia and well beyond. After obtaining his PhD from St Andrews, Michael had a notable career in government and across higher education institutions. He is a prolific writer and has published many books and articles on Australian foreign policy and the politics of state-building interventions. He also writes really well, so I encourage you, go out and look for that writing. You will enjoy it. Michael has recently returned from the Pacific himself, leading a delegation on behalf of the University of Melbourne throughout the region, visiting Samoa, Fiji and the Solomon Islands to strengthen and to expand our relationship in the region. On the same theme, Michael was a key driver in establishing the University of Melbourne Oceania Institute as a vehicle to enhance our partnership with and engagement with the region. Michael is a wealth of knowledge, and I am personally excited to hear the conversation tonight under his guidance. With much anticipation for the discussion ahead, I hand over to Professor Michael Wesley.
Moira, thank you for that very warm introduction. I need to put you in touch with my mother-in-law. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. And can I begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. The title of tonight's seminar, Australia and the Pacific Islands, Solidarity in a Time of Crisis. I think, as Moira said, we need to acknowledge that Australia is a Pacific island. In fact, Australia is part of the largest archipelago of islands on Earth. And when we think about that and when we acknowledge from our Pacific neighbours that water, when you're part of an archipelago, water doesn't divide, water unites. Water brings us together. I think it leads us to have a particularly different view on Australia and its role in the world. And so I think tonight, as we talk about Australia and its Pacific neighbours and our shared solidarity in a time of climate crisis, it really makes us reflect on where we are in the world and what should be important to Australia as it makes its way in the world. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion we're going to have tonight. As Moira said, we have an absolute star-packed panel with a wide range of knowledge and experience who can talk to us about Australia and the Pacific and our shared climate challenges. So let me introduce our speakers tonight. Right next to me, we have Tio Lau Dr. Viliamu Iesi from the School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Sciences. Vili has conducted research and published widely in the field of risk resilience in agriculture, impacts of droughts and extreme events on food security and livelihood, climate change loss and damage, and evaluation of climate change adaptations in Pacific Island countries and small island developing states. And just between you and me, everyone in the Pacific knows Vili. Right next to Vili, we have Professor Celia McMichael, Head of the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Celia conducts research focused on health geography, international health, migrant and refugee health, and climate change-related migration and displacement. Next to Celia, we have Dorothy Foliaki. Dorothy is a graduate researcher and she has a wealth of experience supporting climate action and adaptation projects in the Pacific. She investigates the impacts of climate adaptation tools, specifically land reclamation, on environmental, social and economic dimensions in the Pacific to support resilience and sustainability outcomes in the future. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor John Barnett. John is the co-director, along with Deb McDougall, who's in the audience tonight, of our Oceania Institute. In this role and through his research, John examines social vulnerability and adaptation to climate change in a number of regions, including Australia and Pacific Island countries. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Now, I've given the audience a view of your backgrounds and your expertise, but I'd like each of you very quickly to talk about which countries you work in specifically and the sort of work that you're doing at the moment in those countries. Vili, we might start with you and then go along the panel.
Thank you. Professor Talofalava, everyone. It's very good to be here today. It's an honor to be here, sitting amongst a very, very, very awesome panel tonight. I'm from Samoa originally. I'm a Samoan Matai. I'm a citizen of Tuvalu. I worked in Fiji for about 14 years. Now I live at Penala, very close at the Yota Nation, so I acknowledge the Yota Nations as well, and also the traditional owners of the place that we are in now. I say that because it's very important to my background. I do work across the Pacific as well, so we just launched the Pacific Ocean Climate Crisis Assessment that covers 16 Pacific Island countries. Most of my research is in Fiji, Tailevu Province, Rewa Province, Naitasiri Province, and Yasawa. Sorry, Jason, that I didn't reach Rotuma yet. And also Tonga, mainly in the main island of Tongatapu, Samoa, Tuvalu, and many other Pacific Island countries. But I put this up here. It's a story my great-grandmother talked about a lot before, and it's about the culture of resilience. And I think it's important to bring this forward so that I can bring a little bit on my background and how it connects. She was talking about the migration and the movement of our people, the Polynesian people, and also the Pacific Islands from where they came from about 3,000, 4,000, or many, many years ago, according to her, that the culture of resilience is a culture where they anticipated the risks and act accordingly to reduce those risks. And she was talking about that migration before they sailed eastward. They anticipated very high seas, stormy weathers, so they prepared themselves by building the best seaworthy canoes and some of the best designs. When those early explorers came to the Pacific, they were shocked. When they came in Ndurua and some of those Kalia and Alia sailed around them. And then they also anticipated a long journey, so they developed the knowledge of food preservation, water preservation, and also fishing on the high seas. They also anticipated landing. The pioneers, so they prepared themselves by bringing planting materials and all the cultural and the indigenous knowledge of building, disaster risk management, and a lot of this foresight knowledge there. And foundation to that was the knowledge of how to do it and the capacity of how to do that. And then also important to that was that they're living in harmony with nature at the time, but also with the communal sense that they all need each other to work with. I'm on that boat. I'm a great-grandson of those early navigators. I have no idea how to sail the boat. I get seasick on the boat. So something happened. There's a shift of the culture of resilience to more of, from the culture of risk informed to more of the culture of dependency a little bit. Now it's still there, but so my work is working along those risk spectrum to provide a knowledge systems to support those decision-making of building the culture of resilience and rebuilding the culture of resilience in the islands. No matter what comes, climate change, environmental change, economic stress, and so forth. But climate change is a really, really, really big one. So thank you very much,
Thanks,
Prof.
Billy. Celia.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's also an honour to be here. I'm from Adelaide. I work in Fiji predominantly, so I've been working there for about 10 years. And what I mostly focus on is climate-related migration and mobility. So Fiji, it's not the iconic kind of low-lying atoll nation. It's actually, a lot of mountainous islands, but they're front runners in starting to plan for relocation of low-lying communities. So I've been going to some sites that have relocated, as well as places that are planning for relocation, places that are thinking about it. I'm sure we'll get to this later. The most important thing really for me to say is I find it quite uncomfortable sitting here and talking about Fiji. As I said, I'm from Adelaide, and all of the work that I do is working very closely with the Tarani Nkoro, like the village chiefs in Fiji, with Fijian researchers, with PhD students from the Pacific, and that's the model that I'm really comfortable with. And yet today you have me talking.
Hey.
Dorothy.
Hello, maloelele everyone. Kamda Maori. My name is Dorothy, and I'm a part Kiribati. I'm
Just tell us.
very, very complicated, but I'm a Bannerman Kiribati. I grew up in Fiji. I was born and raised in Fiji, and then I married to Tonga. So I've lived in Tonga for the last 17 years, and a lot of my work experience and research has been in Tonga. So I'm happy to be here to share my experience on what we have done in the government. I was working in the government in Tonga, and we've done a lot of policies, plans about climate change, and also just in general on protecting and managing our environment. And I'm happy to share what we have done over the last, in my work experience with everyone on the real challenges, the lived experiences, and what we are really facing in the islands. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, great to be here, and thanks everyone for coming, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. I've started doing research on climate change, vulnerability and adaptation in the Pacific in 2000, so I guess it's been 25 years. And that isn't, that's different projects in different places. I've been really fortunate to work with a whole bunch of graduate researchers from the region over that time. And it's their research really that you learn from, because they're from those places and they can tell you things that you would never find out yourself. I guess my research is about trying to amplify what we understand about what climate change adaptation is, and then what climate change adaptation could be for different countries, since I think the evidence to ideas kind of space is really important. I'm very concerned, I guess, a constant theme or focus has been about the countries comprised of low-lying atolls in the Pacific. So these are just 2 metres above sea level rings of islands around lagoons, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tokelau, the Marshall Islands, and also in the Indian Ocean, the Maldives are comprised entirely of atolls. Why those countries? There's a justice argument there. They, I think, are the most at risk, particularly from problems of sea level rise. There's an evidence argument there that if we could solve the climate change adaptation problem in those countries, then presumably we could solve them everywhere. In the last few years, that work is really, on my work, others in the group I work with focus in different countries, but my work's been very focused in the Marshall Islands, where we partner with the Climate Change Directorate there, several local NGOs, and some international organisations as well. Doing research, we just did I was part of a big project that went to 15 islands and spoke to 3% of the population about their experiences of climate change and their aspirations for climate change adaptation. Logistically, very complicated piece of research. The messages are pretty simple, just giving voice to those people and making sure that their voice is included in government planning.
Thanks, John. Okay, climate change, it's a big word, it's a conceptual word, there's lots of debate over it. I'd like you to make it real for the audience. What does climate change actually mean? What does it look like for Pacific communities? Dorothy, you mentioned in your opening remarks, you made an allusion to that. Perhaps you could start. What does it really look like if you're a person living in the Pacific?
Thank you. Yes, over the last couple of years, I'll give one example of the work that we've been doing on managing protected areas, marine protected areas. And so one of the islands that we monitored in 2010 has now, we looked at the coral reef surveys, which we actually did this work with an Australian volunteer that came. She's a marine ecologist, and we did some coral reef surveys. This was in 2010. And then 4 years later, 2014, that island has been submerged. And for me, I didn't really, climate change is something that we're still really not really sure if it's really happening, but that for me was sort of evidence that it is happening, that submersion of that island. But it's also talking to the communities, the farmers, they've spoke a lot about how their yield or their crops, the diseases that are affecting their plants. The fishermen have also mentioned how it's becoming difficult to catch fish. They have to go further out. And even from the surveys we did as well, there was a lot of coral bleaching. And so saying that climate change is really happening, I think that's one of the factors. There's so many other factors environmentally of what causes a lot of but the evidence of what we've seen, I think that for me was confirmation that climate change is real. And this is 2014. Now it's 2025, But Tonga is also under the ring of fire. We can't conclusively say that it's climate change, but, we have tectonic movement and all of those things. But I feel that climate change is a big factor as well in that island being submerged. And so that's just from my experience. Thanks,
Dorothy. Billy, did you want to share an observation?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are two words that always come to my mind when we talk about climate change or trying to describe what climate change is. And I think the first one is loss. There's so much loss when it comes to climate change and how the climate change exacerbates a lot of other risks and feed on the other risks there. And it's one of the two existential crises recognized by our Pacific Island leaders because of the severe impact that would happen, especially the loss of a whole country. My country of citizens, Tuvalu, for example, and some of the low-lying ones, but also the loss of land, loss of graves, loss of cultures, loss of houses, loss of crops, and loss of mind. Actually, that is one we're looking at the moment with mental health and a lot of health issues. But the second one is strength. And there is so much pride I have when we talk about climate change. Sometimes we put it at the forefront and then say that the Pacific Island countries are at this level, they are sinking. But at the same time, I see hope and I see strength in the eyes of our people, in our leaders, and I see hope and strength in that. Because not just a culture of resilience, but also, like our youth are saying, that we're not drowning, we are fighting. So I see climate change as a call to act, as also a leadership movement, and it's a time, it's a call to unify everyone, and solidarity is a word there, to come together to work to solve it. It can be done with that strength that we do have. So, yeah, two sides of the coin. Thanks.
Thanks, Philly. Celia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to look at it beyond what it looks like for the Pacific and what it means for the world. Is looking at the experience of what's happening in the Pacific Islands means something very significant for the world. It means something for Australia. We have a responsibility to act. And I think, your comment, we're not drowning, we're fighting, is that, perhaps you've got more to say on this, is that the Pacific Island, my understanding is that are frustrated with being looked to as like these iconic examples of let's see this climate crisis play out and then that'll motivate us to act. Like, no, don't use the Pacific as something expendable to show this is how bad things can get. Act now. So the Pacific contributes such a minuscule amount of global emissions, 0.02% of global emissions from the Pacific. The Pacific leaders are incredibly vocal at the global stage calling for action. So for me, I'm not going to speak to, local experience here, but what that means for us is we have to act. We have to urgently reduce emissions. We have to stop fossil fuel, financing and, yeah.
John.
I think Billy said that really well. I probably shouldn't follow up. The work we did in the Marshall Islands was pretty insightful going out to very remote rural islands, and you would think that sea level rise was the issue, but it wasn't just sea level rise. Drought and heat were huge issues, making groundwater more saline and less safe to drink. Heat was impacting upon the productivity of plants and marine species. The drought and the heat were causing skin conditions, eye conditions, gastrointestinal illnesses. The thing that I think really came through, which I think, was a striking thing, was the gendered aspect of that. And so women are increasingly expected to earn income, and they earn income by harvesting plants and marine species to make crafts which they sell. That's becoming harder because those things are less available. It takes more work for them, or they have to travel more, or they make less money. They're also responsible for procuring water. That becomes harder because there's less fresh water. They have to spend more time on that. Gender norms mean they're also responsible for caring for the people who are sick, and more people are getting sick because of the impacts of climate change, and they are getting sick. The time available for them to do all these tasks is diminished because of heat, and so they can't go out in the middle of the day. It is now simply too hot, and heat is one of the main, probably the one consistent climate impact you hear when you do this research everywhere. It's just too hot to do things anymore. And so because they're responsible for all these social reproduction tasks, because those tasks are increasing and their ability to do those things is being diminished by heat, then there's pressure in the household because they're not making as much money, they're not spending as much time on their domestic responsibilities. And then that's creating issues around family violence and the safety for women. And so, you end up with these strangely paradoxical ideas about climate change adaptation. If you ask women in rural islands in the Marshall Islands what they would like, they'd say that, well, we would like a cyclone shelter that also doubles as a safe house for women. And that's the first thing we want. That's what we need, because that's the way climate change is impacting on our lives.
Fascinating. Okay. Well, let's take the spirit of Vili's not drowning, fighting, and talk a little bit about what Pacific nations are doing to respond, really. Dorothy, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to talk a little bit about nature-based solutions. What are some of the nature-based solutions you've seen in action, and what is the importance of blending these solutions with scientific research?
Thank you. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we did some work on marine protected areas, and these are no-take zones. But marine protected areas are managed by government, and then, but because we have very low resource-based, staff to patrol, it's really hard to patrol and enforce this the legislation under which we implement marine protected areas. And so the Ministry of Fisheries has come up with a different approach, and this is community-based, or it's led by communities. And they've partnered with communities to develop, to establish special management areas. And these are very similar to marine protected areas, but each coastal community has their boundary of special SMAs, they call them. And within the SMAs, there's fish habitat reserves, and these are no-take zones within that special managed area. And in these, we've done some monitoring on these sort of arrangements, and it's also happening in other Pacific Island countries. But from experience, these have worked better than the marine protected areas. And nature-based solutions it's important to use the traditional ecological knowledge that the communities can provide, and complement this with scientific information. And for example, like if we're planting mangroves. Mangroves are part of a lot of nature-based solutions work that we do, replanting mangroves. And when we talk to the communities, they tell us which mangrove species are, that they use for that are of medicinal value, or especially for making cultural handicraft like tapa. They use a special dye in the mangroves. So they tell us which mangrove species that are important to them. And then we collect the seedlings and then establish nurseries to encourage mangrove replanting. And this is more effective because we are able to sustain or replant all of these culturally and ecologically important species rather than just planting one species. Like we're always about biodiversity because that increases resilience to climate change. So essentially we're just doing environmental work in biodiversity, but we're also addressing the climate change problem. And then that's how we work together with communities to build resilience that is equitable and useful for everyone, the communities, the plants, the animals, the marine life, and also the economy. Yeah.
Thanks, Dorothy. Billy, back to you. You do a lot of your research in agriculture, food security. Can you tell us more about some of your work around food security and preserving traditional food systems in a changing climate?
Thank you. Yes, I mentioned earlier that climate change exacerbates a lot of existing risks in the agriculture sector. And there are a lot of these soil health issues and a lot of the use of pesticides, just trying to increase productivity. For the Pacific Islands, I think in general, as I said, we do have two existential crises. One is the impacts of climate change, the adverse impacts of climate change, and the second one is non-communicable diseases. With some of the heaviest people in the world, it's good for rugby and mixed martial arts and boxing. I remember my time when I used to play a lot of rugby. I still do though. And then we have climate change here. So in our work now with the communities in Fiji, Western Philippines, St. Lucia, what's the other saint in the Caribbean, and the Grenadines, St. Vincent and Grenadines, yeah. So we work looking at how to increase agricultural productivity, increase soil health, increase environmental health, increase diet and health of the people, and increase the overall resilience of the food system and the people, because the climate change is a multiplier of some of these existing risks. So we work with the communities, the governments, non-government organizations, and some of the universities in these countries to develop and co-create some of the agroecological interventions, and then the NGOs implement them with the communities, and then we come and measure some of these outcomes that we're hoping for. And we also have a project in Tonga and in Samoa, and it's funded by ACR, and then it's on sustainable agriculture intensification for the same purpose. So in the work in food security and looking at food security purposes and outcomes, it's trying to improve all of this soil health, environmental health, and the health of the people, and also the resilience of the food system itself. Because the underlying problem here, we do have a eating problem in the Pacific. So our food system is very heavily relying on global food system and a lot of importation of food. It varies in atolls. It can be 80% or 90% in some of the atolls. In urban areas, 50% depending on the countries as well. So we do have to work really smart in this way. But I like the way that you were looking at the traditional farming systems. How could this research build the strength of the traditional farming system? In our work in Tonga, it's locally led from the NGO and the government, the Modi Tonga Trust in Tonga. And the CEO asked the question, Billy, do you have evidence that the yam farming system is resilient? I said, I don't know. You Tongan, I'm Samoan. Why are you asking me these questions? Those who understand our cultural rivalry. And then he said that there are many people who say yam farming system, traditional farming system is resilient, but there is no evidence, and especially in the current climate change. So we include the yam farming system in the whole study, trying to understand whether it's still resilient now or it's producing the system or improving the system, especially with a low fallow system now, or we are adding some of the variations within the traditional farming system to improve productivity, improve the health of the soil, and then improve the diets and also the livelihood of the people. and overall uplifting their resilience. So it's an exciting work in this, and we're looking at it as well here in Australia with the Indigenous people's food system in Victoria, and we're looking at that in the Torres Strait and some of this learning from the Pacific. So yeah, it's a complex system, but we having those to work on those multi-asset, multi-frontier way with really good partners on the ground.
I love it. Working together and learning from each other.
Yeah.
Celia, you work on migration as a response to climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about the complexities of migration and what impacts it has on the people involved and the communities that it affects?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a catch-all term, migration. It's, or human mobility, any type of movement of people. But that ranges from disaster displacement, like a cyclone coming through and short-term displacement of populations, through to migration, people perhaps moving from rural to urban areas, through to planned relocation, which is particularly what I work on, where there's a predictable threat which is increasing or escalating, such as sea level rise, and then there's a plan for communities to relocate. So the term migration itself captures a lot. I think in popular imagination or in the media, in the way we think about it, there's a bit of an obsession with this notion that there's going to be large-scale displacement of tens of millions of people, potentially across borders. But when you actually go to places and work at a community level, it looks very different to that. Well, at least in Fiji and in other places in the Pacific Islands. So, for example, one community which has become very well known now, where I've worked for over 10 years, is the first entire community in the world to relocate. And that's called Vunidongoloa. And I think it perhaps points to this point you were making about, it's a threat, but there's also a lot of strength. This was like a community-driven relocation, where the community spent years acknowledging that their seawalls were failing due to sea level rise and trying to think, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to adapt? And they drove that process and worked very effectively with provincial councils, with donors, to set up a relocation that wasn't really beyond their traditional lands. They're still within their traditional land. So it's been quite a good news story in some ways. But then in another side, it will look very different if you don't have traditional land, if there's competition between clans about what their future might look like. So, maybe this is a bit of a human geography point. It's which is part of science. It's pretty hard to say this is what climate migration looks like. In fact, it's really hard to even identify a climate migrant unless there's an incredibly clear climate signal. But you do get that in Fiji.
I used to work with a Canadian who called himself a climate refugee.
Yeah.
Right.
John, you described heat stress, water shortages as something that you'd encountered in Marshall Islands and elsewhere. Are there innovative responses that are emerging from communities to deal with these issues?
Yeah, one of the things we did was ask communities what they want, and when you look at the way climate change impacts upon their lives, then they immediately start thinking about interventions that can stop those things. And so, and the interesting thing about adaptation, particularly in atolls, is when you look at it and you think through the drivers of the problems and you think through the solutions, there's not a lot that is required here that is new, actually. Okay, so, solar photovoltaic reverse osmosis units are providing water are ubiquitous across the Pacific now, so people don't have to drink groundwater anymore. What happens in the Marshall Islands is that they break, and you need a $100 part to fix it, but it costs you $60,000 to get out there on a plane. So actually, we know the technology, but actually the maintenance of that technology, which is impeded by the complete lack of connectivity, in transport, is the big problem. Poor ICT is another issue, and we know when we build that connectivity, livelihoods diversify, people begin to access markets, they begin to access healthcare and education, they become healthier, they become better educated, they become wealthier. So climate change adaptation looks a lot like sustainable development.
Right.
Food security, we know there's plenty of things we can do about that, and Billy's doing things about that. Even thinking about the way islands respond to sea level rise, we know in rural islands anyway, or ecosystems that are not impacted much by human development, by which I mean solid and liquid waste isn't damaging coral reefs, there aren't hard structures protecting the coast. Those islands, the evidence we have from 10 to 20 centimetres of sea level rise so far is that those islands are responding, they themselves are adaptive, right? We know during the Holocene high stand, most of the atolls in the Pacific were above water and it was a metre higher. So we know these islands can grow. The challenge with that is maintaining the quality of those ecosystems so they respond naturally. And the real challenge of that is actually living on islands that are going to be more dynamic. So they're changing shape, the reef crests are moving back. We have in these things modern houses that are made of concrete and better blocks. They're no longer fit for purpose for living in these dynamic islands. We have water systems and sanitation systems that have to be more portable. So there's really not a problem that you can look at when you look at the science of this that you can't solve. The problem is actually bringing all these things to bear and the infrastructure and information and logistic environment that's required and the human resource requirement that's required to make it all work and to make it all work sustainably. So that's kind of the way it works in atoll countries. You can see in rural islands a focus on ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions, livelihood diversification, small-scale water solutions, and there needs to be an awful lot more of that and a lot more connectivity to enable the movement of goods and people and information that provides those opportunities. And then in urban areas, because those environments have been more modified by development and by pollution, that's more of a process of basically island reclamation or land reclamation or island elevation. You look at the Maldives, you see what that looks like. In the Pacific, the country that's doing this very, very well is Tuvalu. If you look at the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project, they're building these really good scientific information, using LiDAR, working out how to extend land, using a kind of mix of hard and soft engineering techniques to kind of grow new land and make land that is more elevated. And other countries will follow suit. Tuvalu is got more plans. The Marshall Islands is making plans for this stuff. Kiribati has plans like this. It's an interesting question about what that costs. There is an estimate that the cost of adaptation in the Marshall Islands is about $9 billion in present value. And people say, oh, that's very expensive. And all I would say to you is $368 billion on nuclear submarines we're not going to get. So whose security at what cost is a very interesting thing to talk about, and we shouldn't be entertaining conversations about that's too expensive, because that really isn't too expensive. And the only other thing I would say about that, back to the migration point, is the other thing that was clear in the survey work in the Marshall Islands was we interviewed 1,362 people. 1,360 said they wouldn't leave. They said they don't want to leave. They want to stay there. These are their islands. These are their homes. They belong to their islands. They're not going to leave. They have a right to remain, and they have a human right to remain. So there's a very strong human rights argument for supporting adaptation in the ways that we know we can do and the ways that we know can probably work.
Okay, so the title of the session is Australia and the Pacific Islands, Solidarity in a Time of Crisis. And I want to ask each member of the panel, from your perspective, what is Australia currently doing to help to demonstrate solidarity or not doing? And what should Australia be doing? Who'd like to start on that particular one?
I'll say a couple of things. Maybe we want to kick this around a couple of times. I think I'll go back to Celia's point, or a point that we really need to underscore, that the scope for adaptation in the islands of the Pacific is totally bounded by the degree to which we reduce emissions. So this is really, really critical, right? And Australia, I think, and this time, okay, Michael, you're going to need to stop me here because I could go off on a tangent. Now is the time for Australia to throw its weight around as a middle power, have an independent foreign policy and have an independent position and try to do better than it's currently been doing, and that includes towards the Pacific Islands. We need to be more ambitious in our greenhouse gas emissions. So the difference now between probably the best case and the worst case climate scenario that we might be looking at globally is about 30 centimetres of sea level rise by 2100. So if we do the best, we'll have 30 centimetres less than if we kind of go on the business as usual track. So 30 centimetres, if you're the Tuvalu, Marshall Islands or Kiribati, makes a massive difference. It's not just the amount of change you have to adapt to, it's the speed of change. And we know that social systems respond to change when it is slow, and they tend to not respond to change very well when it's rapid. You have a rapid economic shock in a least developed country, that's a recipe for all sorts of social problems. We have rapid climate shocks because we have runaway greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to be a catastrophe. So the first thing we have to do is reduce emissions. The second thing in terms of supporting adaptation is, and I have to say this in all honesty, I don't really know. because the Australian government gives this out to a kind of private contracting firm, and I don't know what they do. Now, maybe that's just because I don't work in places where Australia invests, but it's not clear to me. I mean, Villy may have a better idea. ACR, I think, is more engaged, but how Australia supports adaptation, not clear to me, actually.
Yeah, money is, it's easy to default to money, but it's key. We need to pay up. Like a lot of high-income countries need to cough up funds for all these funds that are set up at that kind of global architecture space. Forgive me, I'm going to look at my notes. I'm not good at retaining what you referred to as factoids. But
that was only John's.
That was just they were just John's. They're minor facts. So, I mean, there's some things that are looking positive, that are heading in the right direction. It's easy to get sucked into a gloomy story in this space, and with good reason. But you know, our previous government withdrew from the Green Climate Fund, which is the world's largest climate fund. But in 2023, we rejoined it, so that's good. Pledging $50 million. That's not $9 billion. That's $50 million. Global Environment Facility, contributing $80 million. Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, $50 million. These aren't huge amounts, but we are at least rejoining those efforts to fund. But there is, maybe you know more about this, I'm sure you do, Villy and Dorothy, the Pacific Resilience Facility, which has been set up recently, and that's Pacific-led, Pacific-designed. It's 18 countries that are setting their own agendas and are funding it themselves, as well as with contributions from donors. So I think we're contributing about $100 million to that. But that seems to me like a good way forward. So fund it. We have an ethical responsibility to cough up money. Secondly, stop supporting the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it really, I think this is not going to be a surprising point, and we all read about it in the media, and I'm sure we're all on board given your interest in this topic, but it's simply not ethically or morally acceptable, given our position in the Pacific region, to be having new fossil fuel mines being opened. So 7 new coal mines in the last few years. That's just totally incompatible with solidarity in the region. So yeah, stop fossil fuels and boost our emission targets. 43% is not high enough.
Dorothy?
Okay, well, from the government perspective and also working with development partners, Australia has helped a lot in the country. They've provided support financially funded some of the projects on climate change, and also provided scientific expertise. We've worked with, I think what I'm really saying here is promoting citizen science. And when I was thinking, how can the university or help the countries in the Pacific? And I think citizen science might be one of them, where, you know, I've worked personally with Australian volunteers, but this was 15 years ago, and they've helped develop a lot of our policies with legislation that address climate change, environmental impact assessment regulations and things like that. And also that marine scientist that came when we first did the surveys on the coral reefs. So I think that's where we can partner with Pacific Island countries to share knowledge. It's not just scientific knowledge, but also learning the traditional ways of sustainability. And my research now that I'm doing is climate change, land reclamation, but it's really looking through the sustainability lens and how the traditional people, the traditional ecological knowledge and how they've done sustainability in the Tongan way, that I think can really complement the scientific way, and that will be more effective. And so, yeah.
Thanks, Dorothy. Villy?
I think there have been a lot of wonderful things said already. I think just a couple of things. First is that, yes, I also join Dorothy as well in acknowledging and recognizing the support and the great help from the Australia governments and to all the Australian taxpayers to the Pacific as well. I also strongly agree with Celia and John on the call for commitment to cut emissions, because I think it reminds me of the late Honourable Tony de Bruyn, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Marshall Islands, when he was asked in a meeting, I think in Denmark, whether he was here to save the Marshall Islands. And he says, no, he was there to save the world. And I think it's very important to bear in mind that we're all in this together. And I totally agree that with what Smith said there. I think in terms of support from Australia, I really want to see the increased investment on research, capacity building, and this knowledge creation component to support adaptation, mitigation, and some of this decision making in the Pacific Island countries. And this is very important because sometimes there is a undermining of the science, and people say, oh, because we've been dealing with cyclones all of our years, so we can deal with another cyclone. No. This is a completely different animal here we're dealing with, and it requires another level of skills. It requires another set of knowledge system to add on that already existing system, because there is an urgency of the matter here, and we do not have the time to make mistakes. And I think it's very important for us, for Australia, to add these research and capacity building components to development programs, so that there's a learning element in it, so that you don't think over the mistakes over again, and then learning and then stepwise approach. Second is that climate change should not be a political issue. It should not be polarized, because, as I said, it affects everyone. I have seen the losses and with discussions as well in the farmers I work with in Mildura, in Birchip, in Gippsland, in Riverine Plains, when we had discussions on the losses they suffered in the millennium droughts and some of these things, and the increase of suicide rate, 18%, I think, here during the droughts. And in the Pacific, it's also the same. And it's important as well for us, I think I'm speaking to the public as well, to continue advocacy, continue to speak up for the climate. Don't just speak up for the Pacific, speak up for yourself. Speak up for your communities. Speak up for the world, including the Pacific Island countries as well. And I think I always love this, meeting our Pacific Island students here. It's very inspirational, because you are part of that solution and part of that investment. And imagine if it scale up and more scholarships, more research coming, and more exchanges, bringing the Pacific Islanders here and here to the Pacific Island, and especially working with indigenous communities. For those of you, Pacific Island countries, apart from Fiji, Sikh, and some of the territories, about 99% of the people are indigenous people. And there is so much lesson to learn from working with indigenous people, and the inspiration of recognizing those cultural governance systems, those ownership of resources, and giving them the resources and let them inspire you of finding the solutions, because we can all stand together. In Australia, I also shared with some of my colleagues, sorry that this is a bit longer, sorry about this, Prof, because in Australia, I was surprised because it's a developed country. Until I met the Indigenous People Organisation of Australia, who work with some of the most isolated Indigenous communities. And then I met the Outback Academy that works with Indigenous farmers. And then they were telling me of the situation of the Indigenous communities here. They do not have access to good water and some of those things. So I think in solidarity with the Pacific Islands, just continue the advocacy. It shouldn't be politicized, but now it's politicized. Be involved in the political dialogues and the political process, not just the government, but also Australians as well. So, yeah, and looking forward to do more research in the Pacific. And thank you for more research funds and capacity building and scholarships coming to the Pacific. Thank you. This is me talking directly to the camera.
Yeah. You've just seen Billy the salesman. Yeah. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, over to you. It's time for you to start to ask questions of our wonderful panel. Can I ask that you keep your questions short, and please don't make statements. Please ask a question. Do we have any questions for our panellists? We'll start just down the front here, and then we'll go to the gentleman towards the back.
Obviously, the resurgence of climate denialism under Trump is terrifying, but at the same time, we're seeing a rapid retreat by the United States from aid. What are the implications for programs across the region and I guess across the world in the sorts of things you're doing, in that it now appears that the Americans are abandoning the scene?
I'll put a plug in. The Australian Institute has decided to run a series of conversations with people from the Pacific looking at just this issue, actually. So what are the everyday implications of those geopolitical things? It's a really good question. I heard this morning about the lack of funding for free press in different parts of the Pacific. And so, so media freedom is an issue in the Pacific because the markets are small and because of the influence of governments. And so holding that space for free press in the Pacific has required funding, and that's something the USAID has funded. So we're seeing a contraction of free press, for example, and that's going to flow through into all sorts of other implications. USAID was going to give 14 PhD scholarships or something to USP. I guess they're not anymore. Students who've been on Fulbright scholarships in the United States have suddenly had their funding cut and their visas cancelled and had to leave the country. The other issue that Dorothy can talk about is what's the technical term for people whose visas have expired from the Pacific? I can't remember. But Pacific Islanders, I mean, I sort of follow the Marshallese news, and so Marshall Islands is, okay, I won't go into this, but nuclear testing, Compact of Free Association, US colonisation, effectively citizens of the US, but ICE has been going around and picking up any Marshallese person who doesn't have a current passport or a current visa and exporting them back to the Marshall Islands. They're rounding up Tonga and Samoan gang members in Los Angeles and sending them back to Tonga. So there's, any day now, a plane with 150 Tongans is going to arrive back in Tongatapu with people who never grew up there. So, we have this very strange situation. As Dorothy actually pointed this out to me, the migration discussion in Tonga now is not Tongans are leaving the country. The migration discussion is Tongans coming back from the United States who might not want to be there and who they might not want. So, this is just, they're just some examples, right? We're not even seeing the implications of this yet.
Okay. Gentleman at the back.
Thanks, everyone. Great talk. I also work in resiliency. I look at coral reef resiliency to climate change here at the university. And I find it disheartening that we have to look at resiliency and the fact that this is happening. And what gives you hope that things will get better in this changing world versus continuing on the path forward that it's on and looking at adaptation to an increase in climate versus taking action at a more global level to actually decrease the climate?
Who are you asking to?
What gives you hope that it'll get better before it gets worse?
Well, there's always a discussion on the hope, and sometimes, as Celia mentioned, in the dialogues around, there is a lot of negativity and a lot of what's the English word? I can say it in Samoan, but we'll need a translator. There's always this sense of hopelessness. It's what can we do about it? But there is, as I say, there's a lot of hope in finding these solutions, and it's multi-frontier. First hope is the leadership of the Pacific Island leaders. They are taking the fight, and they are leading in a lot of negotiations, and then there's a lot of advocacy working at that very, very high level. And some of these international policies and some of these, the wording and the language of the Paris Agreement and some of these commitments are coming out of the leadership of the Pacific Island leaders. And yes, they are small countries, but they do have a very strong negotiation package because of their votes in the UN and a very large ocean that we have. There's also hope in our youth and our people because they are driving the change, as mentioned by my colleagues here in Offshore Authority. And every time I see the Pacific Islands people on the ground, they are planting something, they are doing something. They always do something. And some of the commitments that they have made in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases in the countries as well as some like the leading commitments in the world. So that leadership is very, very important. And that driving from the youth and the local leaders are also very important. I also have hope because of you. Because you're doing the research on these coral reefs and some of these solutions in building the knowledge systems that can support the fight for resilience. So while there is an ongoing fight to cut emissions, it's always an ongoing and a lot of commitment to make. We should not stop, and it should not discourage us to doing everything that we could to build our resilience on the ground. Because the alternative of that is very, very, very bad. And it's bad for us in the Pacific Islands. It's bad for you in Australia. It's also very bad for everyone in the world, including America. So that's the hope that I see. I see it in all of us. And yeah.
Oh, Dorothy, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we have been doing monitoring and the adaptation efforts are working. And that gives us so much hope, especially when we involve the communities. And with the last surveys we did in 2020 or after COVID or during COVID showed that these SMAs or these systems that we've established with the communities are working. And that gives us a lot of hope. And there's a lot of communities that have put in their requests to establish these within their own coastal space. And it costs a lot. It's about 100,000 or plus to establish one SMA, and it takes time, and there's not enough staff to keep on. You know, there's so many communities we've received. So a project I recently helped to develop was we're supporting developing six SMAs through the funding from Jeff and UNDP. So it gives us a lot of hope that a lot of these projects are working, and we're thankful that we have scientists also that are helping. There was a PhD student as well from Australia who did his PhD on SMAs. On monitoring SMAs, and that really helped as well. So, yeah, a lot of the adaptation efforts are working. Mitigation as well. We are also Tonga has a target to be on renewable energy, complete generation, renewable energy by 2035, 100% by 2035. It's ambitious targets, but that's part of our commitments towards the Paris Agreement and IPCC. So we are doing our part, and we are also, we feel encouraged because we can see what works and trying to replicate and expand, upscale what's working, but we need help in that area. And so it's good that we are having these conversations. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman up the back in the blue shirt.
Thank you. On the theme of solidarity, I'm wondering how we can have solidarity or increase solidarity across citizens between Australia and the Pacific. I'm thinking that 2022 was the climate election, and I've heard nothing about climate this time around. I've heard about Australia wanting to host COP for status. I've heard about the agreements with Tuvalu and Nauru for geopolitics, but nothing about citizen to citizen. So I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that. And secondly, with indulgence, what number of postgrad scholarships for Pacific students might UniMel be able to offer to show solidarity?
Can you answer the last one again, please? Because I didn't hear it clearly. But it sounds really good. There are people clapping. So can you please repeat that question?
Who'd like to take that one? Maybe Celia?
Look, I'm going to answer this on maybe in a slightly personal way, is that, there's often a question as an academic of how are you making a difference? How is your research contributing? And I would say that one of the most rewarding parts of this kind of endeavour is working with postgraduate students. And Jason up the back there, I see you hiding. Dorothy here, PhD students that are coming and bringing amazing ideas to Australia and working on them and coming up with solutions. So yes, to my mind, this is a great way forward, and I think we should definitely be investing in that.
Okay, we might go to an online question and then there's one down the front here.
I just want to point out he dodged the question about scholarship.
We're working on it.
More.
Okay, we have a question from online. This is probably for Billy or Dorothy, but can you comment on how the school systems in different Pacific Islands are engaging with research and education to help students learn about resilience and climate adaptation?
Dorothy, you go for ladies first.
I think in Tonga they have integrated climate change into all the school systems, into the curriculum, school curriculum. I'm not sure if that's answering the question, but they have integrated climate change into primary school and high school curriculum. And there's also, we have universities, local universities. I'm just not sure how, if there's any specific courses. We work together with USP a lot, but I don't know for Tonga specifically. But that's, I think, John, there's a new university in Tonga, and it's good that I think one of the future or things we need to explore is really to try and enhance the research in the Pacific as well, and how we can establish programs specifically for environment at a level like PhD level. But I think Billy has more experience in the education sector, but that's from Tonga.
I
now
agree.
being advocated.
100% agree, because that's the same thing around the other Pacific Island countries. They have integrated climate change in different basic science subjects, and also all the way up to geography and biology, even agriculture. They integrated in agriculture in the high school level, including the language. They also try to bring how to define some of these technical terms in climate change into the vernacular, because most of the languages in the Pacific doesn't have climate change. It's more of a descriptive, it's a whole sentence or 4 lines of sentences to describe it. And I think it's very important as well to know that there are a lot of community consultations that are happening. There are a lot of champions visiting the schools. And some of these students are also involving in the advocacy and the engagements with non-government organizations, also in the youth groups in the church, and the youth group in the villages. When we go and do consultations, we have youth groups and some of them, and there are discussions as well that they are involved in. We're trying at the moment to look at the role of churches and resilience in Fiji, to look at how we could increase the involvement or the knowledge systems of the church ministers, because they are some of the most powerful agents of change in the Pacific Island society. And then involve this in some of the Sunday school discussions at the moment. In terms of research, we do work in Tonga as well with the mainstreaming of rural development innovation. Tonga Trust is like the number 1 NGO I have seen in the Pacific. Apologies to all the NGOs. Where's the camera? And all the NGOs online. But if you work with Modi, then you know what I'm talking about. And they do a lot of this participatory research in working with the farmers family, in including the children in some of these discussions and getting their perspective. So, because it's very, very important, as John mentioned earlier, that time is an important factor here in the household. There is a changing of dynamics of the households, shifting, including seasonal workers coming here. So there's a shifting, and trying to explain those to the youth and also to the education, to the children is an important one. But there is a bit of a trick here, because the integration, sometimes we say it's increased the knowledge system and awareness, but sometimes it's integrated in the curriculum in order for you to pass the exam. So they cram it, they learn it there just to pass the exam. But we really hope there is Rhonda and her team, well, us, we're working on this home garden in school to trying to teach some of these practices in a much more practical way. So yes, it is happening. I can talk to my cousin, really small one, and he start talking to me about climate change. as well.
Okay. Now, the gentleman down here in the middle, we're getting lots of questions coming in and there's more online. So just this gentleman in the grey jumper. So can we keep our questions short and our answers short as well, so we can get through them?
Thanks. It's a bit of a follow-on. So I spend a bit of time working with meteorological services in the South Pacific, and there is a brain drain problem. Last time I visited Samoa, they had just lost several staff to fruit picking in Australia and New Zealand because that gave more family security than staying working for the government. So as well as training Pacific scientists, how do we enable them to have worthwhile and well-remunerated lives in the Pacific, contributing to society?
Oh, that's a very hard question.
It's kind of quite a profound issue, right? So if you're the head of a government service department in Tuvalu or Kiribati, you've probably got a master's degree from Australia in something. You might be getting 23,000 Australian dollars a year. I mean, you can come here and do anything and triple your income. And so there's doctors, working in meat packing sheds in Australia. It's a huge problem. And it's one of the problems about there's lots of virtues in the expansion of visa schemes from Pacific Islands to Australia in general. But it is taking out, it is accelerating brain drain. That's a real problem. So, there are ways of doing this, I think, that are, so remunerating people better. But I think it's really helpful to think, this kind of goes to your point about people-to-people exchanges. If we can imagine a common labour market and a common pool of people, some people living in the island, but plenty of people from those islands living in Australia, and pairing jobs and pairing work. So they tried to do this in New Zealand, where they tried to get Niue doctors from Manukau Hospital to spend periods of time working in Niue, and doctors from the Niue Hospital work, and so we could imagine that if we have doctors from the Pacific coming to Australia, we might actually get them to work as doctors and not as packing meat. And then that we might actually be thinking about exchanges. And so we're building up cohorts of skilled workers from those places who are working here and working there. And it is a common movement on the labour market in the same way that people come from the country to work in the city and go from the city back to work in the country. That's a really different vision about the way this is, about the way this could work. And if you have enough trained people, if you have enough doctors, it'll work. So it's about meaningful jobs and meaningful remuneration across the system rather than just stuck here or stuck there, if that makes sense.
Can I have a couple of quick ones in this as well, because that is excellent. But there's another side of this as well. I'm including me. When I left the University of South Pacific to come to the University of Melbourne, as Prof said earlier, that everybody knows me in the Pacific. So it's not because it's a small island, it's because I'm cool. But then people say like, oh... It's because you're from a small island. Yeah. Because it's a brain drain, Willie, we're losing Willie. But in the discussions of my contracts before I came, and I thank the Faculty of Science and the School of Agriculture as well, because they allow me. They said, okay, you can still continue to do your research in the Pacific. You can still work, because I was hired there in the Victoria Drought and Innovation Hub as the Associate Director. And then gave me the freedom to engage. So now it's not brain drain, it's brain gain. Because now what they're getting is Willy Plus. So because I'm having a lot of network, we have more research projects and more talking about the University of Melbourne. And thank you, DVC, for your visit to the Pacific, because it elevates that. And then the second thing is on the seasonal workers. We're looking at this as well in our school, of trying to brain gain the seasonal workers and train them on some of these skills of disaster risk management, some of these climate change adaptation. So when they go back, they can contribute. And we had discussions with the National Disaster Management Office of Fiji, and then we said, can you put in your roster that when these guys come, they will go stay in their communities, they will become part of your special force of responders. When they go there. So when they come here, they come to this, but we will give them some specific skills. And then when they go back, they contribute. They go back with an additional certificate of competency. And they will add into the local network as well. So we're brain gaining the system. And I think the University of Melbourne is leading that party in Australia And I'm not afraid to say that because I see the evidence of that in the Pacific. So the ANU people and some of them could disagree with me, but that's their opinion. So, yeah.
Well said.
He's right because he's cool.
So we might go online and then we've got a couple more audience questions.
John, this question is for you.
Yes.
What opportunities are there to engage with the Oceania Institute and climate change research generally in the Pacific outside of postgraduate studies? How can we, the audience, best support this work and get involved?
I mean, we have the Oceania Institute is a very interesting thing in the university in that it's quite small, and so we have a lot of flexibility. We can sort of do what we want, and what we want to do is try and make things better in the Pacific. So we're sort of open to ideas. Happy to hear anything, but also, you know, we have these events and conversation series and stuff, and people are really welcome to come along to those things. We're really trying to connect through Rita has done a lot of work trying to connect the Pacifica community in Melbourne with sort of Pacifica people when they come here, and trying to grow that space, so that sort of vision about, you know, it's one community, not people here and people there. But that idea about a kind of shared community includes, you know, anybody who's interested in the region and you know, wants to help change the situation. Yeah.
Okay, the lady at the back.
Hello. Thanks for this amazing panel. I'm going to change my question because Billy actually anticipated it. You've talked a lot about shared experiences and about, I guess, my question is around the visibility of the realities that you've been talking about, of what it is like for Pacific communities to be experiencing and living with the realities. It feels like there's a hardening of hearts and a closing of avenues for those stories to be authentically shared with the outside world. I'm somebody that's worked in that space trying to get stories out, and I can see the shutters being pulled down, both in terms of funding for telling stories and avenues and publications. I've spent a lot of time trying to think about how else to get these stories more visible and authentic and real, and with all the texture and personality that you're telling us about here. Do you have any ideas? Because I'm running out.
I'm learning all the time about the power and the passion and the extent of the Pacifica community in Australia, who I think are very good advocates for their communities at home, and so they are here and they are within the Australian media sphere, and it may be simply a matter of talking to them as opposed to something else. And I think there's a real worry about the mainstream Australian perception of Pacifica people in Australia, and I think a lot of good work is necessary to promote. And there's wonderful things during COVID about, during disasters, about Pacific seasonal workers helping people through floods and all that great stuff, which is the reality for these people. And the more stories like that, and the more their stories in the media, and the more their stories about climate change in the media, I think is good for the region, it's good for them, it's good for us. I guess I'm saying there's a whole resource here that is also potentially really important for that.
Yeah, just to jump in. I think effectively your question is kind of how can we communicate in a way that's going to affect change, right? And I think throwing everything at it is a good approach. Some of that is the science of climate science, the figures, the stats, long time scales, modelling, forecast. That speaks to a lot of people. Some of it is about economic modelling. If we don't do this, it's going to cost this much. Some of it is about human stories. It's interesting that you say you feel like it's closing down. Maybe you're seeing it. You've got a journalism background, right? Yeah. Yes. Guardian. Yes. So I don't see it that way. I think there's still opportunity. I still see incredibly powerful communication in all kinds of media outlets, in public conversations. I don't know that it's closing. I think for me the question is that going to affect change? Because we've been doing this for decades. Maybe to come back to that question of hope, I don't know that I'm hopeful, but I would say there's one good thing about this problem is we know what's causing the problem and we have a solution. So that is at least one reason to have hope. And perhaps the economics of it is what's going to save us in the end, hopefully, is it's going to become a much more economically viable way forward to pivot to renewable energy. There's just going to become a point where coal-fired power stations are dirty and expensive and no longer viable. I never would have thought capitalism was the answer, but it could be part of the answer.
Yeah, in 2018, after the Katowice COP in Poland, there was a meeting at Winton Park in London, and the former Prime Minister of Tuvalu, Enele Sopoaga, made a very strong statement there that the lack of representation of Pacific realities in the IPCC report. And he was talking about this indigenous knowledge or the feeling of losses because of the cap in communicating it up in the publication to the IPCC process. So it triggered a $5 million project by MFAT, and it's the Pacific Ocean and Climate Crisis Assessment. And there are 19 chapters of this volume 1 that was launched at COP29 in November last year. I lead 3 chapters of it, the food security, loss and damage, and water security. And in those chapters, and there are also interactive things, there are real stories of losses and real experience of losses. And there are discussions of attribution of climate change. And then people say the model, but we talk about the attribution from a community perspective. The sea was 100 meters down there. Now it's right under my coconut tree. There is no other explanation that could explain that in that local context. The grave was there, it's now gone. The house was there, it's now gone. And some of these losses are inside in the accounts in this report. So we can have a discussion after that, after this, and then we'll work with you to open it wider now. They're not closing that window of this communication. So thank you very much.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left, and we're going to take one final question. The lady in the pink top.
The Oceanians.
I hope this doesn't completely blow it out. I did try and end it on a positive note. It's probably more for Dorothy and Celia. Celia, you mentioned a lot about the UN funds, like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund. Of course, some of the hold-ups with these is that they are reliant on voluntary donations from countries, and accessing the funds can be a bit difficult. Alongside that, you've got Singapore, for example, buying up Article 6 MOUs, basically, with a bunch of Pacific islands, a bunch of Asian countries. That's to secure their own requirements under the Paris Agreement. And then in tandem again to that, you've got China also investing in climate solutions across the Asia-Pacific region on a whole. What are the risks for countries from a sovereignty perspective with each of these second approaches, the Article 6 approach, but also the China approach, versus going through the multilateral funding options? And what are the opportunities?
I get the feeling you might be better placed to answer that question than me. Look, I'm just going to put it out there. Climate finance is not my area. It's an interest. You've got to have money to fund these things. So I'm going to step away from answering the specificities of that question. Of course, we cannot just collapse into a situation where everyone's got to find their own funding at a national level. But yes, it does raise questions about dependency and sovereignty and rights. But I'd love to hear your perspective, but I think we're pretty tight on time. But Dorothy, do you want to have a crack at that very difficult question?
You can just say no.
No is also an answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's getting increasingly difficult sometimes to access funding because there's so many requirements now. And for so many different funding, we have GCF, GEF, they have their own requirements. I think it's much easier to get funding from a bilaterally, directly, and that's why I think the Pacific has inclined towards China, because it's very easy to access funding from them. They make it so easy. And so I think that's probably why, there's a lot of influence of Chinese aid in the Pacific, in Tonga also. But it's just how funding, and the communities as well, like developing concept notes and project proposal. It takes years, just 2 years or so to meet all the requirements. And so it's a very long process. So we're always exploring ways to access direct funding, or whatever is easy, we'll take it and we'll use it for the communities and for the government, the NGOs, everyone. So now I think in Tonga, the NGOs have also found their own way of accessing funding. Before it used to be just through government, but now they're empowered to find funding themselves. And the communities are also reaching out to us, how can we access direct aid? So it's a learn, we grow as we learn as we grow and as we go. But yeah, it would be helpful if funding to these would be so easier.
That's really good. I always feel weird when there's a question on sovereignty of our countries when it comes to this aid thing and it comes to this discussion, because there are a lot of countries that also owe a lot of money to China, but you don't ask those countries about their belief in their sovereignty. So what I am trying to say, because it reminds me of a former Prime Minister of Samoa's respond to the question of sovereignty and China and some of these things. And he was saying, like, just trust us, we know what we're doing. And I think it's important as well to know that and those level of high-level discussions and some of those negotiations, yes, there is a risk. But I think we also have to trust that the governments and the leaders of our countries actually know what they're doing. And that's, to me, and that's okay. So it's not a question of whether we will lose our sovereignty to another country. It's a discussion. Even if we look at the Falepili discussion as well, Tuvalu and Australia, there have been a lot of discussions of sovereignty of the oceans and the data and those kind of things. But those are the discussions they have. But to me, it's not a question of whether we will sell our country to another country to get the money to try to save the country, the very country that we're trying to fight for. So, yeah, I should end here before I cry. But thank you very much. It's an important question.
Thanks, everyone. Look, that's all we have time for tonight. I'm sorry for those of you who wanted to ask a question and we didn't get to you. Please feel free to bail up our panel outside over drinks and refreshments. But last but not least, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you to our panellists, either Cool Villy or Villy Plus, Celia, Dorothy and John. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.